The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker and the heartbreak heavier. Sophie Brown stood in the middle of her living room, or what was left of it. The space, usually filled with the warm scent of vanilla candles and old books, now smelled of damp cardboard and panic. She held the letter in her hands. The paper was thick, expensive, a stark contrast to the peeling paint of the apartment walls. The letterhead was embossed in silver ink. Night Holdings. 72 hours, Sophie whispered to the empty room. Her voice cracked, a fragile sound that seemed to shatter against the stacked boxes. How can they give us only 72 hours? She knew the answer, of course. Gentrification. Progress. The ruthless march of the tech industry swallowing the city whole. Her building, a charming but crumbling brick relic from the 1920s, was being razed to make way for a glass monolith, a new server farm or luxury condo complex for the very people displacing her. And the man signing the execution order was right there at the bottom of the page, his signature a sharp, jagged scrawl that looked more like a weapon than a name. Ethan Knight. Sophie crumpled the letter in her fist, fighting back the hot sting of tears. She was 26 years old. She worked 2 jobs, one at the local library and one as a freelance copy editor, and she still couldn't fight a billionaire. Ethan Knight had bought the block, evicted the tenants, and effectively erased her sanctuary with the stroke of a pen. A loud clap of thunder rattled the single-pane windows. Sophie jumped, looking out at the deluge. It was nearly midnight. She needed to tape up the last box of kitchenware, but she felt suffocated. She grabbed her coat, a worn yellow raincoat that had seen better winters, and headed for the door. She needed air, even if that air was drowning in rain. The streetlights flickered overhead as Sophie walked aimlessly down the sidewalk. The for sale and demolition notice signs plastered on every building in the neighborhood mocked her. She wrapped her arms around herself, burying her chin in her scarf. She hated Ethan Knight. She had never met him, never seen his face, but she hated him with a visceral intensity. To him, she was just a statistic, a nuisance to be cleared away. She was turning the corner toward the old bakery that had closed last week, another victim of Night Holdings, when she heard it. A high-pitched yelp. Sophie froze. The wind howled through the alleyway, carrying the sound of trash cans rattling. But the yelp came again. It was desperate, weak. "Hello?" Sophie called out, squinting into the darkness of the alley. "Is someone there?" Nothing but the rain drumming against the pavement. She stepped deeper into the shadows, navigating around puddles of oil and debris. "Hey," she softened her voice. Then she saw him, huddled beneath the overhang of a dumpster, shivering so violently his entire body was a blur. Was a puppy. He couldn't have been more than 10 weeks old. A golden retriever, though his fur was so matted with mud and grease he looked more like a brown rag. Sophie gasped. She dropped to her knees instantly, ignoring the filthy puddle soaking into her jeans. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, reaching out a hand. The puppy flinched, pressing himself harder against the cold metal of the dumpster. He let out a low, terrified whine. "It's okay," Sophie cooed, keeping her hand steady. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." She inched closer. The puppy looked up at her with wide, dark eyes that were brimming with fear. He was soaked to the bone. "You're lost, aren't you?" she whispered. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the puppy sniffed her hand. He licked her fingers, his tongue rough and warm against her cold skin. Sophie didn't hesitate. She unzipped her coat and scooped the puppy up, tucking him inside against her chest. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of exhaustion. He immediately buried his wet nose into her sweater, seeking warmth. "I've got you," she said, stroking his wet head. "Let's get you out of this." She rushed back to the streetlight, shielding the bundle from the downpour. Under the yellow glow, she examined him. He was wearing a collar. It was leather, clearly expensive, with a silver tag that glinted in the light. Sophie brushed the mud off the tag to read the engraving. Barnaby. If found, please return to Penthouse A, the Obsidian Tower, 1101, Summit Avenue. Sophie stared at the address. Her breath hitched. The Obsidian Tower. It was the tallest, most ostentatious building in the city, a spike of black glass that pierced the skyline, visible from anywhere in Seattle, including the window of the apartment she was being kicked out of. It was the headquarters and residence of the city's untouchable elite. And then she looked at the smaller text at the bottom of the tag. Owner, E. Knight. Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. Knight. Ethan Knight. The puppy in her arms, this shivering, helpless creature, belonged to the monster who was destroying her life. She looked down at Barnaby. He looked up at her, letting out a soft sigh as the warmth of her body began to soothe him. Fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. Of course, Sophie muttered bitterly, looking up at the dark silhouette of the obsidian tower in the distance. Of course you belong to him. She stood there for a long moment, the rain soaking her hair. Part of her wanted to take the dog to a shelter. Let Ethan Knight feel a fraction of the loss he inflicted on others. Let him worry. Let him search. But then Barnaby shivered against her heart, and Sophie Brown knew she couldn't do it. She wasn't like Ethan Knight. She didn't punish the innocent for the sins of the powerful. Okay, Barnaby, she sighed, resigning herself to the long walk uptown. Let's take you home to the devil. The walk to Summit Avenue took 40 minutes. By the time Sophie reached the base of the obsidian tower, her sneakers were squishing with every step, and her yellow raincoat was plastered to her skin. Barnaby had fallen asleep inside her coat, a warm, rhythmic weight that kept her grounded as she stared up at the building. It was intimidating. A needle of black glass and steel piercing the stormy sky. It looked less like a home, and more like a fortress built to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep the people inside safe from the reality of the city below. The entrance was flanked by 2 massive stone lions and a revolving door that gleamed under the harsh LED lights. Sophie took a deep breath, clutching the puppy tighter. She looked like something the cat dragged in, drenched, muddy, and shivering. But she had a job to do. She pushed through the revolving door. The lobby was silent and smelled of expensive tea and ozone. The floor was polished marble, so clean she could see her own disheveled reflection staring back at her. A massive chandelier, looking like a frozen explosion of diamonds, hung from the vaulted ceiling. Behind a reception desk carved from a single slab of black granite sat a concierge in a suit that probably cost more than Sophie's car. He looked up as she approached, his nose wrinkling slightly as he took in her appearance. "Deliveries are around the back, miss," he said, his voice clipped and dismissive. He didn't even look her in the eye, returning his attention to a computer screen. And no soliciting. Sophie felt a flash of irritation hot enough to dry the rain on her face. This was exactly what she expected from Ethan Knight's kingdom. "I'm not a delivery girl," Sophie said, her voice steady despite her shivering. "And I'm not selling anything. I'm here to see Ethan Knight." The concierge laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Mr. Knight does not take unscheduled visitors, especially not at—" He glanced at his watch. 1 in the morning. "Please leave before I call security. I found his dog." Sophie cut in. She unzipped her coat slightly. Barnaby's golden head poked out, his ears perked up at the sound of voices. He let out a small, confused woof. The concierge froze. His eyes widened. The dismissive mask shattered instantly, replaced by a look of sheer panic. That's Barnaby?" the man stammered, standing up so fast his chair knocked against the wall. "Mr. Knight has had the entire security team combing the neighborhood for 3 hours. He's in a state. Well, I found him in an alley off Pike Street," Sophie said coldly. "Call him." The concierge didn't argue. He snatched up the phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed. "Mr. Knight?" "Yes, sir. I'm sorry to disturb you, but there is a woman in the lobby. She has the dog. She has Barnaby." Yes, sir. Right away." He hung up and looked at Sophie with a newfound respect, or perhaps fear. "Go up," he said, gesturing to the private elevator bank at the far end of the hall. "Penthouse. The elevator is unlocked for you." Sophie walked across the marble floor, leaving a trail of muddy water droplets behind her. She felt like an intruder, a virus entering a sterile system. She stepped into the elevator. There were no buttons, just a card reader that flashed green as soon as the doors closed. The ascent was smooth and silent, but her ears popped as they skyrocketed 40 stories in seconds. With every floor they passed, Sophie's heart hammered harder. She was about to face him. The eviction notice felt heavy in her pocket, burning against her thigh. She should throw it in his face. She should scream at him. She should demand he rescind the order in exchange for the dog. No, she told herself. That's blackmail. I'm not a criminal. I'm just angry. The elevator chimed softly. The doors slid open. There was no hallway. The elevator opened directly into the living room. If Sophie's apartment was a cozy, clutter-filled shoebox, this place was an airplane hangar designed by a robot. The Walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the rain-swept city lights. The furniture was low, angular, and black. There were no photos, no knickknacks, no signs of life. It was beautiful, breathless, and utterly cold. "Where is he?" The voice came from the shadows near the window. It was deep, commanding, and laced with a jagged edge of panic. A man stepped into the light. Ethan Knight. He was taller than she expected. He wore a charcoal gray dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with tension. His hair was dark, slightly messy as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. His face was sharp angles and hollows, handsome in a severe, unforgiving way. But it was his eyes that caught Sophie off guard. They were blue, icy, and piercing. But right now, they were wide with genuine fear. Sophie stepped out of the elevator, clutching the puppy. "He's right here," she said softly. Ethan crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't even look at Sophie. His entire focus was on the bundle of wet fur in her arms. "Barnaby," he breathed. The harshness in his voice evaporated. He reached out and Sophie passed the puppy to him. Ethan pulled the dog against his chest, burying his face in the dirty, wet fur without a second thought for his expensive shirt. He closed his eyes, exhaling a breath that sounded like it had been held for hours. The relief radiating off him was palpable, raw, and surprisingly human. Barnaby licked Ethan's chin enthusiastically, his tail thumping against the man's arm. Sophie stood there awkward and dripping on the pristine rug, watching the monster embrace his dog. It was disorienting. She wanted to see the villain who signed the eviction papers. Instead, she saw a man who looked like he had just gotten his heart back. After a long moment, Ethan seemed to remember he wasn't alone. He opened his eyes and looked at Sophie. The vulnerability vanished instantly, replaced by a guarded professional mask. He straightened up, shifting Barnaby to one arm while keeping a protective hold on him. He scanned Sophie from head to toe. He saw the worn sneakers, the cheap raincoat, the frizzy hair ruined by the rain. He didn't sneer, but his gaze was clinical, assessing. "Where did you find him?" he asked. His tone was back to being the CEO, transactional. "In an alley behind the old bakery on 4th, Sophie said, crossing her arms defensively. He was hiding under a dumpster. Ethan's jaw tightened. The dog walker lost him. She said he slipped his collar, but Barnaby has never run off before. He looked at the dog, scratching behind his ears. "Thank you." The words were right, but the tone was stiff. He turned and walked over to a sleek black desk, opening a drawer. He pulled out a checkbook. "You brought him back. You didn't call the pound. I appreciate that." He grabbed a pen and scribbled something quickly, then ripped the check out and held it toward her. "This should cover your trouble," he said, not looking up. "And the cab fare home." Sophie looked at the check. She didn't take it. She didn't even look at the amount. The casual way he tried to pay her off, as if she were a vending machine that had dispensed a service, ignited the anger she had been suppressing. "I didn't do it for the money," Sophie said, her voice hard. Ethan paused, his hand still extended. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He seemed confused by her. Refusal. In his world, everyone wanted something. "Everyone does things for money," he said flatly. "Take it. You look like you need it." The insult landed like a slap. It wasn't malicious. It was just a factual observation from a man who saw poverty as a problem to be solved with a signature. Sophie felt the eviction notice in her pocket again. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Knight." She spat out the name like a curse. "I just couldn't leave a helpless animal to die in the rain, even if he belongs to you." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. He lowered the check. He sensed the hostility now. "Do I know you?" he asked. "No," Sophie said. "You don't know me at all. You just own the building I live in." She turned to leave, her hand reaching for the elevator panel. "Wait." Ethan's voice stopped her. It wasn't a command, but it was close. Barnaby, sensing the tension or perhaps just hungry, let out a sharp bark and squirmed in Ethan's arms. Suddenly, the dog began to retch. Before Ethan could react, Barnaby vomited a mixture of muddy water and whatever trash he had eaten in the alley all over Ethan's charcoal shirt and the pristine white rug. Ethan froze, looking down at the mess with horror. He looked completely out of his depth. He held the dog away from him like a ticking bomb. "Oh, God," he muttered. "What do I do? Is he sick? Did you feed him something?" "I didn't feed him anything," Sophie said, turning back. She saw the panic in his eyes again. This master of the universe who could dismantle companies with a phone call was paralyzed by a sick puppy. He probably drank dirty water, Sophie said, her instinct to help overriding her anger. Put him down, don't shake him. Ethan placed the dog on the floor gently, but he backed away, looking at the vomit with disgust. I need to call the vet, he said, reaching for his phone. Or a cleaner. Barnaby whimpered and stumbled, looking dizzy. He walked toward Sophie and sat on her wet sneaker, leaning his head against her leg. Sophie looked down at the dog, then up at the helpless billionaire. He needs water, she said, sighing. And rice. Bland food. Do you have rice? Ethan stared at her blankly. I have a personal chef who comes in the mornings. I don't know what's in the kitchen. Sophie rolled her eyes. Of course. Show me the kitchen, she ordered, forgetting for a second that she was speaking to the man who was evicting her. Unless you want him to throw up on your Italian leather sofa. Next, the kitchen was exactly what Sophie expected. A sterile masterpiece of stainless steel and black marble that looked like it had never seen a crumb, let alone a dog. It was bigger than her entire apartment. Sophie marched in, Barnaby trotting weakly at her heels. Ethan followed, looking like a guest in his own home, holding his soiled shirt away from his chest. Rice, Sophie commanded, opening a cupboard at random. It was empty. She opened another. Empty. Do you actually live here? She asked, turning to look at him. Or is this just a display model? Ethan looked offended. I eat out. Or order in. I'm busy. Too busy to buy groceries for your dog? She shot back. Barnaby has a specialized diet delivered weekly. Ethan defended himself, pointing to a high-tech fridge. It's in there. Organic lamb and quinoa blend. Sophie opened the massive fridge. Inside, there were rows of perfectly labeled dog food containers, a bottle of champagne, and 3 bottles of water. That was it. He can't eat the lamb right now, it's too rich, Sophie said, grabbing a water bottle. She found a bowl on the counter, probably meant for decorative fruit, and filled it. Barnaby lapped it up greedily. Check the pantry again. Top shelf. Maybe there's something from before, from whenever you moved in. Ethan sighed, clearly annoyed at taking orders in his own penthouse. He walked to the pantry, stretching to reach the top shelf. His shirt rode up slightly, revealing a glimpse of taut skin and muscle. Sophie looked away quickly, annoyed at herself for noticing. Found it, he muttered. He pulled out a dusty bag of jasmine rice. Expired 3 months ago. It's rice, it doesn't expire. Sophie grabbed the bag. Do you have a pot? Ethan pointed to a deep drawer. Sophie got to work. She boiled the rice into a soft mush, found a can of pumpkin puree in the back of a cupboard, a miracle, and mixed it in. But she didn't feed him yet. She set the bowl on the cold marble to cool, and gave Barnaby just a small amount of water. We have to wait, she told Ethan, checking her cheap wristwatch. He needs to keep the water down for 20 minutes before we try solids. We have to let his stomach reset. Ethan stood by the island, leaning against the marble, watching her wait. He watched her stroke the dog's fur, murmuring soft assurances, patiently counting down the minutes. He wasn't used to waiting. In his world, everything was instant. But Sophie sat there, content in the stillness. 20 minutes passed. Barnaby was fine. Sophie sat on the floor, hand-feeding him the cooled rice mixture. You're good with him, Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. The puppy was eating slowly, his tail wagging a lazy rhythm. Animals are easy, Sophie said without looking up. They tell you exactly what they need. They don't have agendas. And people do? Sophie looked up then. Her eyes were hazel, flecked with gold, and currently hard as flint. People sign papers that ruin lives. Without blinking, she said. So yes, I prefer dogs. Ethan frowned. The comment was specific, personal. You're still angry about the check, he guessed. It's not the check, Ethan, she said, using his first name for the first time. It sounded intimate and accusatory all at once. She stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. Barnaby let out a contented burp and rested his head on his paws. Asleep. He's fine, she said. He just needed to settle his stomach. Keep him on the rice for 24 hours, no treats. She grabbed her yellow raincoat from the counter. I should go. Wait. Ethan pushed off the island. He didn't want her to leave. It was irrational. It was 1 a.m. She was rude, dressed in rags, and hated him for some reason he couldn't fathom. But the penthouse felt too big again at the thought of her walking out the door. It's pouring outside, he said. Let me call my driver. He can take you home. Sophie laughed, a bitter sound. My home? She repeated. That's rich. She walked to the elevator. Ethan followed, confused. What does that mean? Sophie spun around, her hand on the eviction notice in her pocket. She couldn't hold it in anymore. The adrenaline, the fatigue, the absurdity of saving the puppy of the man who was making her homeless. It boiled over. She pulled the crumpled letter out and slammed it against his chest. You want to take me home, Mr. Knight? Which home? The one I have for 2 more days? Or the cardboard box I'll be living in next week? Ethan caught the paper as it fluttered down. He smoothed it out. He read the header. Eviction notice. He read the address. 420 Elm Street. He read the signature. Ethan Knight. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Ethan looked up from the paper. His expression had shifted. The arrogance was gone. He looked struck. You live in the Elm Street tenement, he said slowly. I did, Sophie corrected, her voice trembling, until you decided a glass tower was more important than the 30 families who live there. I didn't know, Ethan said. It was a weak defense and he knew it. You signed it. Sophie pointed at the paper. I sign 1,000 papers a week, Ethan snapped, defensiveness rising. I don't read every address. My acquisitions team handles the portfolio. They told me the building was derelict, uninhabited. Uninhabited? Sophie's eyes filled with tears of rage. Mrs. Higgins in 2B has lived there for 40 years. I planted a garden on the roof. It's not derelict. It's our home. Ethan looked at the letter, then at Sophie. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the mud on her shoes, the pride in her posture despite everything. He felt a strange sensation in his gut. Guilt. He hadn't felt it in years. It was uncomfortable. I can't stop the demolition, he said, his voice dropping. The permits are pulled. The contractors are paid. Ideally, the project is already in motion. Of course. Sophie wiped a tear from her cheek furiously. Business is business. She pressed the elevator button. Goodbye, Ethan. Take care of your dog. He's the only one who seems to like you. The elevator doors opened. Sophie, stop. He moved fast, blocking the door with his hand. The sensor beeped. Get out of my way. I can't stop the demolition, he repeated, looking her dead in the eye. But I can offer you a job. Sophie stared at him, mouth agape. A job? Are you insane? I don't want to work for you. You already did. He gestured to the sleeping dog. Barnaby hasn't eaten in 2 days. The walker quit because she couldn't handle him. He trusts you. Ethan took a step closer. The air between them crackled. I need a live-in dog sitter. Temporary. 2 weeks. Until I find a permanent solution. He looked at her wet clothes, her desperate eyes. It comes with room and board, he said quietly. Here, in the guest suite. Sophie laughed, incredulous. You want me to live with you? After you evicted me? I'm offering you a roof over your head, Ethan said, his voice serious. And a paycheck that will let you put a deposit on a much better apartment than Elm Street when you leave. He held out his hand, not with a check this time, just an open palm. Business is business, Sophie. You need a home. I need someone who can keep my dog alive. Do we have a deal? Sophie looked at his hand. She looked at the elevator that led back to the rain and the boxes. She looked at Barnaby, sleeping peacefully on the rug. She hated him. She really did. But she was also smart. She took a deep breath. If you ever speak to me like I'm an employee, she warned, I will feed you the expired rice. Ethan's lip twitched. A ghost of a smile. Understood. Sophie reached out and shook his hand. His grip was warm, firm, and electric. The deal was struck. The enemy was now her roommate. Sunlight at 40 stories up didn't filter in. It assaulted. Sophie woke up gasping, blinded by the sheer brilliance of the morning sun exploding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest suite. She sat up, disoriented, her hand clutching sheets that had a higher thread count than her entire wardrobe combined. For a second, she thought she was back in her drafty bedroom on Elm Street. Then she saw the minimalist white nightstand, the remote-controlled blackout curtains she hadn't known how to close, and Barnaby sleeping belly up at the foot of the bed. Reality crashed down on her. She was living with the enemy. Sophie groaned and flopped back, onto the pillows. What have I done? She whispered. Barnaby heard her and woke up instantly. He trotted up the bed and licked her ear, his tail wagging with zero regard for her existential crisis. Okay, Sophie laughed, pushing him away gently. I'm up. Let's go see if the vampire is awake. She climbed out of bed. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt she had dug out of her backpack and a pair of flannel pajama pants. She looked like a sleepover guest who had gotten lost in a museum. She opened the bedroom door and stepped into the main living area. The penthouse was transformed by daylight. Last night it had been shadowy and moody. Today it was a blinding expanse of white, chrome, and glass. It felt like living inside an ice cube, and standing in the center of it was the Iceman himself. Ethan was standing by the kitchen island reading a tablet while sipping espresso. He was dressed for war, a navy blue suit tailored to within an inch of its life, a crisp white shirt, and a tie, knotted with mathematical precision. He looked fresh, sharp, and devastatingly handsome. Sophie, conscious of her messy bun and flannel pants, felt a spike of annoyance. Who looked that good at 7 a.m.? "You're up," Ethan said without looking up from his tablet. "Good morning to you too," Sophie mumbled, heading for the coffee machine. "Is it safe to use, or do I need a security clearance?" Ethan finally looked up. His eyes swept over her pajamas. A muscle in his jaw ticked, but his expression remained impassive. "Top button. 1 press. Don't change the settings." Sophie pressed the button. The machine whirred aggressively. "So," she said, leaning against the counter as the coffee dripped. "What's the protocol here? Do we salute when you leave? Do I need to sign an NDA before I walk the dog?" Ethan set the tablet down. He looked tired, Sophie realized. Despite the perfect suit, there were shadows under his eyes. "The protocol is simple," he said. "Keep the dog alive. Keep the apartment clean. Don't touch my work documents, and don't bring guests." Sophie scoffed. "Guests? You mean like a date?" "Don't worry, Mr. Knight, I wouldn't subject anyone I like to this mausoleum." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Mausoleum? It's cold." Sophie gestured around with her mug. "It's empty. There are no books, no plants, no photos. It looks like a waiting room for purgatory." "It's efficient," Ethan corrected. "Clutter is a distraction." "Life is clutter," Sophie countered. "Barnaby, come here." The puppy bounded over. Sophie sat on the floor, the expensive, pristine floor, and started wrestling with him. Barnaby let out happy yips, his claws clicking on the marble. Ethan watched them. He stood perfectly still, clutching his coffee. He looked like an alien observing a new species. "You're sitting on the floor," he stated. "Chairs are overrated," Sophie said, looking up at him. "You should try it. Might loosen that tie a bit." Ethan checked his watch abruptly. The moment of observation was over. The schedule was back in charge. "I have to go, my driver is downstairs." He walked to the foyer, grabbing his briefcase. He paused at the door, turning back to look at the girl in flannel and the golden puppy rolling around in the center of his multi-million-dollar fortress. "Here," he said, tossing a key card onto the console table. "Access to the building and the service elevator. There's a credit card next to it for the dog's expenses. Food, toys, whatever." "Just the dogs?" Sophie asked, standing up. "And yours," he added, his voice stiff. "Get whatever you need. Food, clothes that aren't." He gestured vaguely at her pajamas. "Flannel. I like flannel," Sophie said defensively. "I noticed," Ethan said. He opened the door. "I'll be back at 7. Don't burn the place down." "No promises," Sophie called out as the door clicked shut. Silence rushed back into the penthouse. Sophie looked at Barnaby. "Well," she said, "he's delightful." Barnaby barked. "You're right. Let's mess this place up." The day was a blur of activity. Sophie took Barnaby for a walk, navigating the snooty doorman who looked at her like she was a thief. She bought dog food. She bought groceries. Real food, like eggs, milk, and cheese, filling the sad, empty fridge. But then she got bored. The penthouse was too quiet. It unnerved her. So she did what she always did when she was stressed. She baked. By 6:45 p.m., the penthouse no longer smelled like ozone and nothingness. It smelled of cinnamon, roasted chicken, and rosemary. Sophie had found a Bluetooth speaker system hidden in the walls and synced her phone. 80s pop music was blasting through the apartment. Girls Just Want to Have Fun bounced off the glass walls. Sophie was in the kitchen, singing into a wooden spoon, wearing one of Ethan's spare aprons, which was comically long on her. Barnaby was chasing a tennis ball she threw down the hallway. She didn't hear the elevator chime. She didn't hear the footsteps. She was mid-spin, belting out the chorus when she turned around and nearly collided with Ethan Knight. He was standing in the entrance to the kitchen. He had stopped dead in his tracks. His briefcase was in his hand. His tie was undone, hanging loose around his neck. He looked shell-shocked. The music was loud. The smell of food was overwhelming. The dog was barking. And there was a woman dancing in his kitchen. For a man who controlled every variable of his life, this was chaos. Sophie froze. Her eyes went wide. She scrambled for her phone and killed the music. Silence crashed back into the room, but the scent of rosemary lingered. "Hi," Sophie squeaked. "You're early." Ethan blinked slowly. He looked around the kitchen. There were flour-dusty footprints on the floor. There were pots on the stove. "What?" His voice was hoarse. He cleared his throat. "What is that smell?" "Dinner," Sophie said, straightening the apron. "Roast chicken, potatoes, and I made apple crisp." Ethan stared at her. "You cooked." "Well, I wasn't going to eat the expired rice again," she said, crossing her arms. "And I assumed you eat something other than the souls of your competitors." Ethan didn't smile at the joke. He looked dazed. He walked into the kitchen. He didn't yell about the mess. He didn't complain about the noise. He walked straight to the stove and looked into the pot. He inhaled deeply. His shoulders dropped an inch. "My mother used to make roast chicken," he said quietly. It was so soft Sophie almost missed it. He turned to look at her. The harsh overhead lights caught the gold flecks in her eyes. "I haven't smelled this in 20 years. Sophie felt the breath catch in her throat. For a second, the billionaire was gone. There was just a tired man standing in a messy kitchen, looking at a pot of chicken like it was a time machine. The tension shifted. It wasn't the angry friction of last night. It was something heavier, warmer. "Well," Sophie said, her voice softer now. "It's ready, if you want some." Ethan looked at her. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back up to her eyes. The air between them suddenly felt very thin. He started, then shook his head, as if waking up. "I have more work to do. I'll eat in my study." The wall went back up. The mask slid back into place. "Make a plate for yourself," he said dismissively, turning away. "And clean this up." He walked out, grabbing a bottle of wine as he went. Sophie stood there, gripping the wooden spoon. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She should be annoyed at his dismissal. She should be angry that he retreated to his cave. But all she could think about was the look in his eyes when he smelled the food. It looked like hunger, and not just for the chicken. The storm hit at 9 p.m. It wasn't just rain this time. It was a full-blown electrical tempest battering the glass walls of the obsidian tower. Sophie was in the living room, curled up on the rug with a book she'd bought earlier, ignoring the massive, uncomfortable sofas. Barnaby was asleep near her feet, twitching in his dreams. The apartment was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city and the occasional rumble of thunder. Ethan hadn't come out of his study since the chicken incident. A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the entire building. The sound was deafening, like a bomb detonating right outside the window. Immediately following it, the lights flickered once, twice, and then died. The penthouse was plunged into absolute darkness. "Great," Sophie sighed, closing her book. Just what this haunted house needed. Atmosphere. Before she could reach for her phone, a frantic scrambling sound erupted next to her. Barnaby let out a high-pitched yelp of terror. The puppy, spooked by the thunder and the sudden dark, bolted. "Barnaby!" Sophie called out, fumbling for her phone flashlight. "It's okay, buddy." She turned on the beam, sweeping it across the room. The puppy was gone. She heard whining, coming from down the hall, from the direction of Ethan's study. Sophie scrambled to her feet and ran toward the sound. The door to the study was ajar. She pushed it open. The study was illuminated only by the gray, ghostly light of the storm outside. Ethan was sitting at his desk, illuminated by the glow of a laptop running on battery power. But he wasn't working. He was frozen, looking down. Barnaby had bolted straight into the room and wedged himself into the tight space under Ethan's desk, right between the billionaire's feet. The puppy was shaking violently, letting out pathetic little cries. "He's terrified of storms," Sophie said, rushing into the room. "I can see that," Ethan said, his voice tight. He pushed his chair back slowly. "He's shaking the whole desk." Ethan looked down at the quivering ball of fur. He looked helpless again. That same expression from the first night. He reached a hand down tentatively. "Hey," he murmured. "It's just noise. Stop it." Barnaby didn't. "Stop." Another clap of thunder boomed, and the puppy whined louder, pressing his face against Ethan's expensive leather shoe. "Move," Sophie said, dropping to her knees beside his chair. "Excuse me?" "Move over, he needs pressure. It calms them down." Sophie didn't wait for permission. She crawled under the massive mahogany desk. It was a tight squeeze. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, startled, as Sophie invaded his personal space. "Helping him," she whispered. She gathered the trembling puppy into her lap, wrapping her arms tight around him. She began to hum a low, steady melody, rocking him gently. "It's okay," she cooed. "I've got you. The sky is just grumpy tonight." Under the desk, it was intimate, a secret cave away from the storm. Sophie was sitting cross-legged, Barnaby curled in her lap, and Ethan was still sitting in his chair, his legs bracketing them. He watched her. The light from the laptop screen cast sharp shadows on his face. He watched her hand stroking the dog's fur. He listened to her humming. Slowly, drawn by a gravity he couldn't fight, Ethan leaned forward. He slid off his chair and sat on the floor next to her. Now they were both under the desk, shoulders brushing. "He's calming down," Ethan observed softly. "Yeah," Sophie whispered. He just needed to know he wasn't alone. She looked up. Ethan was inches away. In the dim light, his eyes were dark pools. The scent of him, cedar wood and expensive scotch, filled the small space, overpowering the smell of rain. "You're good at this," Ethan said, "fixing things." "I'm used to chaos." Sophie shrugged, but her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You learned to find the calm spots." "I don't have calm spots," Ethan admitted. "My life is just noise, constant noise." "Maybe you're listening to the wrong stations," Sophie said. Ethan looked at her lips, then up to her eyes. The air in the small space became heavy, charged with static that had nothing to do with the storm. He reached out. His hand, warm and large, covered hers where it rested on Barnaby's back. Sophie's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. "Sophie," he said, his voice rough. "Ethan," she breathed. He leaned in, closer. She could feel the heat radiating off him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" "For the eviction," he said. And this time, he meant it. "I should have checked. I should have known." Sophie looked at him, searching for the lie. She didn't find one. "You can't fix it," she said, softly. "It's done." "I know," he said. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a slow, mesmerizing rhythm. "But I can fix this, right now." He wasn't talking about the apartment. He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to her mouth again. Sophie's lips parted slightly. The attraction that had been simmering under the anger and the banter finally boiled over. He was going to kiss her, here, on the floor, under a desk, in the dark. And God help her, she wanted him to, just as his breath brushed her cheek, just as her eyes began to flutter shut. The power came back on. The overhead lights blazed to life, flooding the room with harsh, unforgiving brightness. The spell shattered. Barnaby barked, startled by the light, and jumped out of Sophie's lap, tail wagging, the fear forgotten. Ethan and Sophie froze, blinking in the sudden glare. The reality of their position, huddled together under a desk like teenagers, crashed down on them. Ethan pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He scrambled to his feet, adjusting his tie, his face flushing slightly. Sophie crawled out from under the desk, standing up and smoothing her shirt. She couldn't look at him. I should check on the kitchen," she stammered, backing toward the door. "Make sure the surge didn't fry the fridge." "Right," Ethan said, turning away to look at his laptop screen, though his eyes weren't focusing on anything. "Right. Good idea." Sophie fled the room. Ethan stood alone in the bright study. He looked at his hand, the one that had touched hers. He clenched it into a fist. He was in trouble, big trouble, because he didn't just want to protect her anymore. He wanted her, and she was the one woman in the world he had no right to have. 5 days. That's how long it took for the obsidian tower to stop feeling like a fortress and start feeling like something else. A routine had set in, a dangerous, comfortable routine. Mornings were coffee and quiet nods. Evenings were Sophie cooking, because she refused to let Ethan order takeout, and Ethan working at the kitchen island just to be near the smell of food, and her. Barnaby was the bridge. The puppy loved them both with equal, indiscriminate fervor, forcing them to sit together on the sofa, to walk together in the park, to laugh when he tripped over his own paws. It was Wednesday night. Sophie was chopping vegetables for a stir-fry. Ethan was loosening his tie, leaning against the counter, telling her about a ridiculous board meeting he'd sat through. "So he actually slammed his fist on the table?" Sophie asked, laughing. "Twice." Ethan smirked, grabbing a slice of red pepper from her cutting board. He said my sustainability initiative was hippie nonsense. Well, tell him your dog sitter is a hippie, Sophie teased, swatting his hand away. Stop stealing the ingredients. Ethan caught her wrist. He didn't let go. His thumb brushed over her pulse point. The laughter died in his throat. He looked at her with that intensity that always made Sophie's knees weak. I don't care what he thinks, Ethan said softly. I like the hippie. The air in the kitchen grew thick. Sophie looked down at his hand holding hers. It felt right. It felt like it belonged there. Ethan, she whispered. He leaned in. This time there was no storm. No power outage. Just them. His phone buzzed on the counter. A harsh, vibrating drill sound. They both jumped. The moment broke. Ethan sighed. Frustration etched on his face. He released her wrist and grabbed the phone. He looked at the screen. His expression hardened instantly. The warmth vanished. I have to take this, he said. His voice clipped. He turned and walked out to the balcony, sliding the glass door shut behind him. Sophie watched him go. She felt a cold prickle of unease. She went back to chopping, trying to shake it off. It's just business, she told herself. Then her own phone rang. It was sitting on the counter next to where Ethan's had been. The caller ID read, Mrs. Higgins. To be. Sophie's heart sank. Mrs. Higgins was her elderly neighbor from the Elm Street building. Hello? Mrs. Higgins? Sophie answered, wiping her hands on a towel. Sophie, dear. The old woman's voice was shaking, thin with panic. I didn't know who else to call. There are trucks here outside the building. Sophie froze. Trucks? What kind of trucks? Construction trucks. Men in hard hats. They're putting up fences, Sophie. They say they're starting early. Tomorrow morning. Tomorrow? Sophie gripped the counter. No, that's not right. The notice said 72 hours. That's Friday. We have 2 more days. They said the schedule changed. Mrs. Higgins was crying now. They're boarding up the front door. Sophie, I haven't finished packing my china. I don't know where to go. Stay inside, Sophie ordered, panic rising in her throat. Do not open the door for anyone. I'm coming. I'm coming right now. She hung up. She looked out at the balcony. Ethan was still on the phone. He was pacing. He looked angry, gesturing at the city below. Sophie walked to the glass door. She didn't open it. She just watched him. She saw him mouth the words, Elm Street, then demolition, and finally, proceed. Sophie felt the blood drain from her body. He knew. He wasn't just taking a call. He was giving the order. Or worse, he had known all along that the timeline had moved up, and he hadn't told her. He had been flirting with her in the kitchen, stealing peppers, making her feel safe, while his crews were outside her home, terrorizing an 80-year-old woman. Ethan hung up and turned around. He saw Sophie standing behind the glass. He saw her face. He froze. He knew instantly that she knew. He slid the door open. Sophie. He started, reaching for her. Wait, I can explain. Sophie took a step back, recoiling as if he were radioactive. You're doing it tomorrow, she said. Her voice was deadly calm. The contractors pushed the schedule, Ethan said, quickly, stepping into the kitchen. There was a permit issue. If they don't start fencing tonight, the whole project gets delayed by 6 months. It's a logistical nightmare. A logistical nightmare? Sophie let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. Mrs. Higgins is crying in her living room. She has nowhere to go, and you're worried about permits? I tried to stop it, Ethan insisted. That's who I was fighting with on the phone. I told them to wait. But you let them proceed, Sophie accused. I saw you. You didn't say stop, you nodded. Ethan clenched his jaw. I have investors, Sophie. I have a board. I can't just halt $100 million project because of me? Sophie finished for him. Because it's complicated, Ethan shouted, slamming his hand on the counter. You don't understand how this works. I don't have absolute power. The wheels are turning. I can't just stop the machine. You built the machine, Ethan, Sophie screamed back. You are the machine. She ripped the apron off and threw it on the floor. I thought you were different, she said, her voice breaking. I thought maybe you were just a guy who loved his dog, but you're exactly who everyone says you are, a coward with a checkbook. Sophie, don't, Ethan pleaded. He looked desperate now. Don't leave. We can figure this out. I can get Mrs. Higgins a hotel. I can pay for movers. I'll fix it. You think money fixes everything, Sophie said, shaking her head. You can't buy dignity. Ethan, and you can't buy me. She grabbed her bag. Where are you going? Ethan moved to block her path. You can't go down there. It's a construction zone. It's dangerous. I'm going home, Sophie said, pushing past him. To stand with my neighbors, to help them pack, to do what decent people do. She stopped at the elevator. She looked back at him one last time. Barnaby was sitting by the kitchen island looking between them, confused and sad. You keep the dog, Ethan, she said softly. He deserves a warm bed, even if the owner is cold as ice. The elevator doors opened. Sophie stepped in. Ethan stood in the center of his perfect empty penthouse. The smell of burning vegetables began to fill the air. The stir-fry was ruining on the stove, but Ethan didn't move to turn it off. He just watched the numbers on the elevator plummet, taking the only warmth his life had ever known down to the street level, back to the war he had started. Elm Street looked like a crime scene, portable. Floodlights washed the old brick building in a harsh, blinding white glare, bleaching out the warmth of the street lamps. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and shouting. A chain-link fence had already been erected around the perimeter, cutting off the sidewalk. Behind it, massive yellow excavators sat like sleeping dinosaurs, waiting for morning to feed. Sophie jumped out of her cab before it even fully stopped. She didn't have an umbrella. The rain mingled with the grit in the air, stinging her face. Mrs. Higgins, she screamed, running toward the police tape. A wall of private security guards stood between the street and the building entrance. They were big men in black rain ponchos, looking bored and dangerous. Behind them, on the steps of the building, a small group of tenants was huddled together. Mrs. Higgins was there, clutching a birdcage, looking small and terrified in her nightgown. Hey, Sophie shouted, ducking under the police tape. Let me through. That's my grandmother. She lied effortlessly. She would have claimed to be the Queen of England if it got her past the line. A beefy guard stepped in her path, his hand landing heavy on her shoulder. Restricted area, miss, he grunted. Property of Knight Holdings, no access. People are still inside, Sophie yelled, shoving his hand away. You're boarding up a building with people inside. That's illegal. We have a vacate order, the guard said, unmoved. They were supposed to be out by midnight. We're just helping them along. Helping? Sophie pointed at Mrs. Higgins, who was sobbing into a neighbor's shoulder. You're terrorizing them. Get out of my way. She tried to push past him. The guard grabbed her arm hard. Listen, lady. You need to back off or I'm putting you in zip ties for trespassing. Get your hands off her. The voice didn't shout. It didn't have to. It cut through the noise of the generators and the rain like a razor blade. The guard froze. He knew that voice. Everyone who worked for Knight Holdings knew that voice. He turned around. Ethan Knight was standing on the other side of the police tape. He wasn't wearing a raincoat. His suit was soaked instantly, his white shirt clinging to his skin. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked wild. He looked furious. Mr. Knight? The guard stammered, loosening his grip on Sophie. Sir, we were just securing the perimeter as per the... I said. Ethan walked forward, stepping over the tape as if it didn't exist. Get your hands off her. The guard released Sophie immediately, backing away with his hands up. Sophie stumbled back, rubbing her arm. She looked at Ethan. She expected him to look at her to check if she was okay, but he didn't. He was looking at the building, at the excavators, at the crying old woman on the steps. It was one thing to see numbers on a spreadsheet, asset 420, demolition pending. It was another thing to see the tears on Mrs. Higgins' face, to smell the fear, to see the life he was crushing. The reality of his legacy hit him harder than any board meeting. Shut it down, Ethan said. The foreman, a man with a clipboard and a hard hat, jogged over. Sir, we're on schedule. The overtime is approved. If we stop now, the union will... I don't care about the union, Ethan roared. The sound echoed off the brick walls, silencing the murmuring crowd. He turned to the foreman, his eyes blazing. Turn off the lights. Unlock the gates. Send the crew home. But, sir, the foreman argued, confused. The demo is set for 6 a.m. The explosives are already... If you touch one brick of this building... Ethan stepped into the foreman's personal space, radiating menace. I will bury you under so many lawsuits your grandchildren will be paying legal fees. Do you understand me? The foreman went pale. Yes, sir, shutting it down. Now! Ethan shouted. The foreman scrambled away, yelling into his radio. One by one, the blinding floodlights flickered and died. The roar of the generators cut out. The yellow machines sat silent in the dark. The sudden quiet was deafening. Ethan turned to the security guards. "Get out," he ordered. "All of you. Off the property." They didn't argue. They scattered like cockroaches when the light turns on. Ethan stood alone in the rain, his chest heaving. He looked up at the old, crumbling building. He saw the flower boxes Sophie had mentioned. He saw the peeling paint. It was ugly. It was worthless real estate. And it was the most important thing in the world because she loved it. He finally turned to Sophie. She was standing 10 feet away, water dripping from her nose, staring at him with wide, shocked eyes. "You stopped it," she whispered. "I can't undo the last 3 years, Sophie," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. He walked toward her, ignoring the mud ruining his shoes. "I can't unsign the eviction notices, but I can stop this. Tonight." He reached into his jacket pocket. For a second, Sophie thought he was going to pull out his phone again, to call a lawyer, to find a loophole. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of paper, the deed to the land. He held it up in the rain. It was getting soaked. "This project is canceled," he announced, loud enough for Mrs. Higgins and the neighbors to hear. "The Obsidian Tower expansion is dead." "Ethan," Sophie said, stepping closer, "you'll lose millions. The board will fire you." "Let them," Ethan said. He looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. A real, reckless smile. "I already have a job. I'm a dog sitter, remember?" Sophie let out a choked laugh that turned into a sob. She ran to him. She didn't care about the mud. She didn't care about the neighbors watching. She crashed into him, wrapping her arms around his wet neck. Ethan caught her, burying his face in her hair. He held her tight, as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her ear. "I'm so sorry. You fixed it," she cried into his shoulder. "You actually fixed it." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. He wiped the rain from her cheek with his thumb. "I'm not doing it for the building, Sophie," he said intensely. "I'm doing it so you don't look at me like I'm a monster. Because I can't handle that. I can handle bankruptcy. I can't handle you hating me." "I don't hate you," Sophie whispered. "Good," Ethan said. "Because I think I'm in love with you." The confession hung in the air, heavier than the rain. Sophie stared at him. The ruthless CEO, the man who drank espresso in a suit at 7 a.m., the man who had just blown up his career for a crumbling brick tenement. "You're an idiot," she smiled, tears spilling over. "I know," he said. And then he kissed her. It wasn't tentative like the moment under the desk. It was fierce. It was a claim. It was an apology and a promise all wrapped in one. Around them, the neighbors cheered. Mrs. Higgins clapped. But Sophie and Ethan didn't hear them. They were too busy building something new. Not made of glass and steel, but of something much stronger. The roof of 420 Elm Street didn't look like a demolition site anymore. It looked like a miracle. It was a warm Saturday evening in July. String lights were draped between the new cedar pergolas, casting a soft golden glow over the rooftop garden. The smell of blooming jasmine mixed with the scent of charcoal from a grill. There were no hard hats, no police tape, just the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Mrs. Higgins was sitting in a new patio chair, holding court with a group of neighbors. She looked 10 years younger, her birdcage sitting next to her, the canary singing happily. Sophie stood by the railing, looking out at the city skyline. The Obsidian Tower was still there, piercing the clouds in the distance, but it didn't look like a threat anymore. It just looked like an office. The building beneath her feet hadn't been razed. It had been reborn. Ethan hadn't just stopped the demolition. He had bought the building personally, independent of Knight Holdings. He had hired the crews not to destroy, but to restore. The brick was repointed. The plumbing was replaced. The roof was turned into the oasis Sophie had always dreamed of. And the rent? Frozen for life. "You're brooding," a deep voice murmured in her ear. Sophie smiled, leaning back against the solid chest behind her. "I'm not brooding," she said. "I'm admiring the view." Ethan Knight wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and a soft linen shirt, sleeves rolled up. He looked younger, lighter, as if the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. "The view is okay," Ethan teased, kissing her cheek. "But the company is better." "How was the board meeting?" Sophie asked, turning in his arms. "Boring," Ethan shrugged. "They're still complaining about my ethical pivots. Profits are down 3% because I refused to evict a community center in Portland. They think I've gone soft." Have you? Sophie poked his chest. Completely, he admitted without hesitation. And I've never slept better. A massive golden blur shot across the roof, interrupting the moment. Barnaby, now a fully grown 80-pound golden retriever with a coat like spun silk, came barreling toward them. He had a stolen hot dog bun in his mouth. Barnaby, drop it! Sophie laughed, trying to grab the bun. Barnaby ignored her, wagging his tail with enough force to generate a breeze, and pranced away triumphantly to hide his prize behind a planter. Ethan watched the dog, shaking his head. We really need to work on his discipline, he said, trying to sound stern but failing miserably. He's a free spirit, Ethan. Sophie grinned. Like his dad. Ethan looked at her. The humor faded into something deeper, more intense. He reached into his pocket. Speaking of free spirits, he said, I have something for you. Sophie's breath hitched. Ethan? He didn't kneel. He knew she hated public spectacles, but he held out a small velvet box. Inside wasn't a diamond. It was a key. An old-fashioned brass key. What is this? Sophie asked. It's the master key to the building, Ethan said. I transferred the deed this morning. Sophie stared at him. What? I'm not the landlord anymore, Sophie. Ethan said softly. You are. You and the Tenants Association. It belongs to the people who live here. It belongs to you. Ethan, tears pricked her eyes. This is millions of dollars. You can't just give it away. I didn't give it away, he corrected. I invested it in the only thing that actually matters. He took her hand, pressing the key into her palm and closing her fingers over it. You taught me that a home isn't walls and a roof. It's the people you fight for. You saved me, Sophie. You and that damn dog. Sophie looked at the key, then at the man who had once been her enemy, the man who had learned to love the chaos of a messy kitchen and the smell of wet dog. I love you, she whispered. I love you more, he answered. He kissed her under the string lights, surrounded by the flowers she planted and the people they saved. Barnaby barked happily from the corner, the stolen bun long gone, ready for his next adventure. The stray had found a home, and the CEO had found a heart. Ethan proved that the greatest power isn't in what you own, but in what you give. If this story warmed your heart, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. And tell us in the comments, if you found a lost puppy today, would you keep him? Type yes if you're a dog lover. Thanks for watching. And remember, kindness always comes back to you.